Well, good afternoon to everyone here. I'm Professor Hazel Bryan, and as Dean of the School of Education and Professional Development, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first of our HUD-CREST seminars. We're restarting our events programme to engage local, national and international audiences with our research. The School of Education and Professional Development is committed to sharing our research and expertise with our partners, academic researchers, policymakers, schools, colleges, practitioners, third sector organisations, the lifelong learning sector, businesses, and the general public. So, welcome everyone to this seminar entitled Education and Extremism, English Schools on the Front Line of the Prevent Strategy. And so I'm now going to hand over to Professor Thomas for the first part of the presentation. Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to have you with us. As Hazel indicated, today's seminar is around the prevent strategy, and particularly the prevent duty and how it's been implemented in English schools and colleges. Its introduction in 2015 was internationally unique. And so there's been a great deal of international as well as national interest in what's seen as an unprecedented placing of a legal formal duty on both individual educators but also educational institutions, a duty that's also been placed on health and welfare professionals as well. And the placing of that duty in 2015 has done two things. It's certainly put educators at the forefront of counter-terrorism policy efforts, but it's also therefore placed educators and education at the centre of the significant public debate and controversies about the prevent counter-terrorism strategy and what its impacts are. I've actually been researching the prevent strategy with colleagues since its introduction in 2006-07, and also been working closely with end users such as local authorities and educational institutions. That's because my interest is how is prevent actually being implemented, and what are the impacts of it, and what are the perceptions of it at ground level. And I want to draw on that body of research today to do a couple of things. In a brief way, I want to make some comments around the context of prevent and how we got to the point whereby the prevent duty has been implemented in English schools and colleges. But then I want to draw on research that I carried out with colleagues from Coventry and Durham universities, which was the first national study of how the prevent duty was being implemented from 2015, and draw on that research to highlight the key findings that came out of that, but also to identify what are some of the continuing issues and areas for further study that research suggested. So firstly, I want to say something about the changing nature of Britain's prevent strategy. What is fair to say is that what prevent has changed and developed very considerably since its introduction in 2006-07. And that what prevent does now, what it focuses on and what it involves, is really significantly different from what it started out as. And one comment I'd make is that many of the controversies and public debates around prevent often reflect what prevent was, not the reality of what it is and how it's been implemented today. In my previous writings, I've identified distinct phases within prevent's implementation. I've talked about phase one of its initial introduction through to 2011 as prevent one, and then prevent two from 2011 onwards, with a significant sort of acceleration of that phase from the 2015 introduction of the prevent duty. And it's important to say that there have been significant tensions over prevent within national government, between national government and local government, and also within political parties over the course of prevent. That partly explains how it's changed significantly over that time, but it's also important to say these are not left-right sort of tensions. They're actually different understandings, different philosophies about what is effective preventative activity in the face of a terrorist threat. So The Prevent 1 phase explicitly focused exclusively on British Muslims and Muslim communities, and that explicit focus has really been the source of much of the controversy around Prevent. The idea that Prevent only targets one community or one background stems from that initial focus, and it still impacts on how Prevent is being understood today in some quarters. Also, it's important to say that phase 1 was almost entirely done through local authorities and through community-based work, particularly youth and community work, which is my own background, how I came to research Prevent. And schools and colleges were explicitly not encouraged to play a role in Prevent. So the role of formal education only comes in much later in the Prevent story. From Prevent 2 came about after the 2011 Prevent review, and that did a couple of things. It firstly widened the scope of Prevent. So previously the focus had only been on Islamist-inspired extremism and terrorism, whereas since 2011 Prevent has explicitly been concerned with all forms of violent extremism and terrorism. But it also downplayed the community-based element. And what has grown since then in Prevent is the focus on individuals vulnerable to radicalisation, ways of identifying those individuals and referring them to the channel scheme. And obviously that was accelerated, deepened and formalised with the 2015 Prevent duty. And what a key concept that we can see throughout the history of Prevent is responsibilisation. Who's actually responsible within Prevent for identifying the threat and countering the threat? In the first phase, it was very much Muslim communities who are being responsibilised as partners with government. What we can clearly see since the introduction of the Prevent duty is that it's frontline educators and other frontline professionals who are now being responsibilised for making Prevent effective, both as individuals and as part of their institutions. Hence why schools and colleges are now at the forefront of Prevent debates. And this watershed very much came about with the 2015 Counter-Terrorism and Security Act that introduced the Prevent duty. Firstly, why did the duty come in at that point? Already there was concern that schools and colleges should be taking Prevent seriously. Ofsted was already foregrounding Prevent implementation within their inspections prior to 2015, but in 2015 government felt a more formal legal responsibility was necessary. And that was prompted by 3 factors really. One was the very considerable number of young people, young adults who travelled to Syria or attempted to travel to Syria to take part in conflict there. Another one was the murder of Lee Rigby by 2 men who should have been identified prior to that. But there was also the Trojan Horse schools controversy around Birmingham schools and the allegation that extremism had taken hold in those schools. And our Huddersfield colleague, Dr. Shamim Mir, has written very sort of importantly around that controversy, but it was certainly seen as one of the drivers of the necessity to bring in a formal legal duty. And what as many practitioners who are taking part in today will well know, there was 2 distinct strands to the Prevent duty that was introduced. So one was this focus on safeguarding, that Prevent should be implemented within education as part of wider safeguarding duties and safeguarding procedures. The other one was the necessity to promote fundamental British values as it was originally couched in the duty, although language and approach has changed somewhat since then, and obviously Hazel's presentation will be addressing this very much. So both safeguarding but also fundamental British values, to a twin track sort of strategy within the Prevent duties implementation within education. What we saw very quickly after the Prevent duties introduction within education was a very significant increase in referrals to channel from educational sort of sources, from schools and colleges. And a very large number of those were Muslim young people. What it also immediately sort of sparked was very significant press sort of media concern around what the intention was of the prevent duty and what its impacts were. And there were a number of high profile individual stories, some of which were not factually accurate, such as the one around the terrorist house, a young person who apparently said they lived in a terrorist house when they meant to say a terrorist house. The idea that prevent got involved in that situation is actually factually untrue. But the other story presented here about the young girl in a Luton nursery who mispronounced cucumber as cooker bomber and was referred to prevent is true. And so that raised issues about, is this representative of what the prevent duty impact would be as fully implemented? And it certainly led teachers' unions in the early years of the prevent duty to call for it to be scrapped and as not be appropriate. So for that reason, myself and colleagues from Coventry and Durham University designed the first national study about how prevent was being implemented in English schools and colleges. And we really wanted to have a much better picture of how representative or not those individual stories and the media controversy around them were of what was actually happening in English schools and colleges. And our focus here was very much on the educationalist. So I need to say that straight away. This was not about student or community experience. It was about the experience and the understanding of educationists and how they were implementing the duty in practice. And we had a number of research questions that were identified there. How the prevent duty is being interpreted, how confident staff felt around this implementation, what impacts staff felt, if anything, staff felt that the duty was having on the school and on their interactions with students and parents, and to what extent college staff and school staff opposed or questioned the very legitimacy of this new duty. The report front cover is there and it's available for download not only from our university website but from Coventry and Durham, but also from the Aziz Foundation. I think it's important to say that this research was actually funded by the Aziz Foundation, a Muslim civil society think tank. It wasn't government funded, and we felt that was very important to visibly demonstrate that the research we're carrying out was not government funded, had that sense of independence. How did we do the research? Well, we were explicitly focusing on the first 18 months after the prevent duty was introduced in July 2015. We wanted to capture that initial implementation, and what I'm going to do is highlight some of the findings, as I said, but also flag up some of the things that need continued further research. And it was a mixed method study. So we did in-depth qualitative interviews with 70 professionals in 14 schools and colleges in West Yorkshire and London. West Yorkshire and London were partly chosen because both regions had been at the forefront of terrorist plots, terrorist actions, and therefore encompassed local authorities that were seen as priority areas in prevent funding terms. We tried to get a sample of primary schools, secondary schools and colleges, and we also tried to get a range of demographic profiles for those institutions. So some that were very ethnically mixed, some that had a very significant number of Muslim students, and some institutions that are mainly white backgrounds. We also did qualitative interviews with local authority prevent practitioners in a number of local government areas. These are staff who played a very, very strong role, as our research showed, in supporting the implementation in schools and colleges. And then we also carried out an online survey of educational professionals nationally, almost half of which were from further education colleges. This was an in-depth survey. Alongside this, we had both formative and summative discussion meetings around the findings with a number of different parties there, because we explicitly wanted to influence debates and thinking and understandings with those different groups. So that included trade unions who'd been negative about it, Muslim civil society groups who were very questioning of the move, but also officials at the Department for Education and the Home Office about how practitioners were actually understanding this. Much to our surprise, as well as the surprise of some of those stakeholders I've just mentioned, we found very little overt opposition to the prevent duty amongst educationists, and that was very contrary not only to what trade unions suggested who represent that staff, but also the tone of much public debate. And that disjuncture in itself was very interesting to us. One immediate understanding of why there's very little overt opposition might be that modern educationalists are so beaten down by how many government strictures and requirements that they don't oppose any of these, they don't think about them, they just pragmatically accept them or go with the flow of anything that's presented to them. We didn't accept that understanding, and instead we saw that relatively little overt opposition as the product of individual and collective educationalist production of three sets of narratives: how they made sense of the prevent duty, how they implemented in the course of that what they were doing with the prevent duty. So briefly, though, they were narratives of continuity with existing practices, narratives of agency and responsibilisation, that term that I mentioned earlier, but also narratives of risk and radicalisation. In the time available, I just want to say something about each of those. So firstly, the narrative of continuity was the overwhelming finding. And it was very clear to us that people working in schools and colleges accepted the prevent duties proposition that prevent should be seen as a form of safeguarding and is a legitimate part of wider safeguarding approaches. And you'll see the quotes, the illustrative quotes I've included there, that people accepted the concept of vulnerability, and that vulnerability to extremism, whether that's online or offline, is very similar to the types and the mechanisms of vulnerability of other social harms, such as child sexual exploitation, gang involvement, etc. In some cases, they saw the same young people as being potentially vulnerable, but in other cases, they saw it as the same pattern and the same context that would provide that. So there is also significant continuity in terms of fundamental British values being implemented, in the sense that educationists talked to us about how they mapped their existing curriculum and content and approach, and found that they were already covering a lot of the British values in what they did already. So in both cases, there was a great deal of continuity, particularly safeguarding, that the continuity concept was foregrounded. The educationists have very great confidence about their own safeguarding mechanisms internally, in terms of how they pass concerns on to senior management, how those are considered, and also externally about how those substantial concerns are then shared with external safeguarding boards locally. So that confidence in existing safeguarding mechanisms made people feel clear and confident about how to report prevent concerns within that. And so here we also had a form of policy enactment in that prevent was being melded in and fitted into existing approaches to safeguarding. Similarly, there was policy enactment around British values, in the sense that while there was a mapping, schools were also doing things alongside British values to ensure that they had their own take on it, so that, for instance, there was a significant focus on right-wing extremism within individual institutions, to make sure that there was no concern that prevent and fundamental British values input was only focusing on one committee or one community, or only focusing on British Muslims. So great deal of continuity there, and acceptance that it wasn't such a big change. And I think we have a very stark disjuncture there, where externally to education, the prevent duty is perceived as a very big change to what educationalists and education is being asked to do, whereas people within schools and colleges didn't perceive it as a very substantial change. And that was our clearest finding. Clearly, then, there's this sense of responsibilisation, as I mentioned earlier, and educationists are having this duty put on them, And the duty is very real. The weight of the duty is very real. Ofsted have foregrounded this within inspection. Implementation of Prevent has been high up Ofsted agenda as they've inspected institutions. And Ofsted inspections obviously come with risk. If schools do less well in them, they have tangible sort of implications. But we found that people didn't have a problem with that, because part of modern education is that they are responsible to Ofsted and responsible to government and other forms of stakeholders. And accepting of that responsibility around Prevent is no different from accepting responsibility towards Ofsted generally. So this wasn't a new pressure, if we want to put it in that way. And in that way, then, the people that we interviewed and researched with had a very particular take on these example schools, colleges, nurseries who seem to have implemented Prevent badly. From an external point of view, the cucumber bomb sort of example as a test case would be seen maybe as an anti-Muslim sort of institution, an Islamophobic response to a child's comment. But from our respondents, they saw this much more as a generically bad institution, one that had not followed its own procedures to carefully check what was known about a child, known about the family, had looked at the whole situation of what they knew, and had then attempted to talk to the family. Instead of going through their normal generic safeguarding procedures, they had panicked and immediately gone external to make a Prevent report. And for our respondents, that wasn't an anti-Muslim school or a fault of the Prevent duty. It was a school not following professional procedures and protocols. So the other narrative we identified is one of risk, and that comes directly from the responsibilisation. I indicated the risk of not doing Prevent properly, of failing to implement it, and the risk then of a negative Ofsted inspection, the risk of comeback if a young person who was being radicalised was not spotted and reported. There may then be sort of consequences for the individual educators and their institution. But again, our respondents were very clear that this comes with the territory of working with education. That sort of risk is held and carried constantly by educators across the whole range of student welfare. So the real risk that they identified in our research was the risk to the student. Their worry was that there was a risk that they would miss a young person who is being radicalised, who was vulnerable to radicalisation, and they'd fail to spot it and fail to help them. So they're very clear. Their concern was about the student themselves. We interviewed in a couple of institutions where young people had actually travelled to Syria and sadly died, and the staff we interviewed felt they'd failed, even though it's not clear that they'd missed anything, but they felt they'd failed the student. Now, the idea that Prevent is a legitimate form of safeguarding has been challenged by social work academic colleagues who say it's a perversion of safeguarding, that this is not a vulnerable young person. This is actually a focus on young people that are a risk to us rather than being at risk. But that's not what came through in our research. It was very clear that educators that we talked about saw Prevent as being a way of helping and protecting the students they care and they love about. And that's why they were able and willing to implement the Prevent duty in the way it was being suggested. What I'd like to do is finish with just highlight, firstly, this new book that came out earlier in the summer, which was edited by my research partner, Joel Busher and Lee Jerome from Middlesex University. And what that has is a number of chapters by academic colleagues, all based on empirical research from different sectors, from early years through to further education. And in each case, the authors have done further empirical research around how educators and students in those particular sectors are understanding the implementation of the Prevent duty. What that research shows very clearly, and it really supports our initial findings about the acceptance of the safeguarding paradigm. But what it also does is raise further questions about British values and about how how effectively they are being implemented, and concerns that educators have about how effective they can be, and the support that they get around doing pedagogical input, how effective that help and support and guidance is. Some of those issues may well come up in questions. I value hearing responses from those who've either researched this issue or work in education institutions about particularly how the British values part of the prevent duty is being implemented. But first, we're going to hear from Hazel, who's with her input on the British values debate. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So colleagues, I'm now going to turn to my presentation, which is entitled The Prevent Effect, Secular Nationalism and Fundamental British Values. And this presentation is based on a forthcoming book by Professor Lynn Revel from Canterbury Christ Church University, Professor Sally Elton-Chalcraft from Cumbria University, and myself, in which we draw upon our previous empirical and theoretical research from 2010 to the present to argue what we are terming the prevent effect. In 2001, England was in shock at riots that had broken out in 3 towns in the north of England. Arguably the result of a failure of multiculturalism, the shock reverberated around a country that held its breath. How had it come to this? In 2005, England was once again in shock when devices were detonated on a double-decker bus and on the London Underground, acts that were perpetrated by home-grown bombers. And once again, a country held its breath and asked, how has it come to this? And this has happened again and again. In the 2 decades since 2001, the United Kingdom has evolved a litany of policies drawn from counter-terrorism legislation that now informs the practice of education professionals and the quotidian experiences of pupils in schools. Similarly, technologies of immigration have been developed that construct the citizen as border enforcer. Such societal securitisation saw expression in the Home Office's Hostile Environment campaign and the more recent Windrush scandal. And in a time when migration requires a particular global response, the UK has voted to withdraw from the European Union. Our forthcoming book, Prevent in Education, Teaching in an Age of Extremism, brings together what we have learned from our research in relation to schooling, learning and teaching in what some have termed securitised times. So, drawing on the following empirical research projects that have included, amongst other samples, 60 schools with 48 head teachers and 12 assistant or deputy head teachers, and 150 ITE students across a variety of other research projects undertaken by Professor Revel, Professor Elton-Chalcraft and myself since 2011, and our theoretical research since 2011. Our central argument in the book is the concept of what we are calling the prevent effect. And clearly the 2 slides we've just shown are just a snapshot of the work that we've been undertaking. It's not possible to get 3 professors' work from the last decade on 2 slides. But our central argument in the book is the concept of what we're calling the prevent effect. The prevent effect is the interplay between 3 phenomena that we suggest have emerged since 2001. The 3 phenomena that work in concert to produce the prevent effect are the construction of the vulnerable, who is and who is not, the chilling effect, is there, isn't there, and the rise and consequence of secular nationalism. Well, there's not time today to discuss the construction of the vulnerable or the chilling effect, and so I'm going to focus on the rise and consequence of secular nationalism, with this expression in fundamental British values in the teacher standards. And it's helpful, I think, to first contextualise the rise of secular nationalism and the emergence of fundamental British values in contemporary society and policy developments. And so this presentation is therefore in 2 parts. Part 1 sets out the education policy context that relates to radicalisation and extremism in schools in the UK, situating education-related issues within a wider socio-political context. And part 2 considers the way in which fundamental British values emerged from a context of nationalism, civic nationalism and secular nationalism. I then consider the place of fundamental British values within the teacher standards and their enactment in the curriculum. And hopefully in this draw upon some of the issues that Paul raised in his presentation. Part 1. In July 2011, the policy document Contest was published by the UK Home Office, within which the Prevent strand is of most significance to education. The UK Counter-Terrorism and Security Act was subsequently published in 2015, which Paul has set out. Since 2012, the teacher standards, informed by the Prevent strategy, state that teachers should promote fundamental British values within and outside of the school in order to enable pupils to develop a counter-narrative to the narratives of radicalisation and extremism. Thus, teachers take on the mantle of both policy subject and policy actor. The contemporary approach to addressing radicalisation and extremism in the UK has its roots in 3 terrorist attacks, one in the USA in 2001 and 2 in England in 2001 and 2005. And these attacks arguably changed forever the interface between education and security and, perforce, education policy, teacher practice and the curriculum. The initial catalyst for UK government action in response to radicalisation and extremism was the attack by Al-Qaeda against the United States on the 11th of September 2001. The concept and discourse of radicalisation began to be developed and used more widely following this series of attacks, and the first iteration of Prevent was subsequently crafted, as Paul has indicated, and there have been revised editions since. The second catalyst for current policy and practice was the attack in London on the 7th of July 2005, which became known as the 7/7 London bombings. Perpetrated by 4 homegrown suicide bombers, these were young men who'd been born in the UK and educated in the Western liberal state school system, and yet they bombed the capital. The burning question asked by a shocked government and people was how and why this had happened. The third catalyst for contemporary policy and practice in the UK also took place in 2001. Unrest and riots in 3 northern towns resulted in formal investigations and 3 major reports: the Cantle report, the Denham report and the Ritchie report, all of which highlighted the problems caused by the segregation of communities, the lack of economic opportunity, the role of the far right in inciting violence, and the roles of the police and community leaders in supporting cohesion. The notion of community cohesion was questioned in these reports, and the premise of multiculturalism was subsequently increasingly seen as problematic. The concern over the perceived weakness of multiculturalism was expressed by German Chancellor Angela Merkel in an interview with the BBC in 2010, in which she suggested that there were inherent problems in, as she said, living side by side. But as far back as 2004, Trevor Phillips, chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, suggested that, quote, multiculturalism suggests separateness. And so emerges a changed discourse in which connections are starting to be made between multiculturalism and the problems that were given expression in, for example, the public disorder in the 3 northern towns. Ragazzi suggests that this shift in the discourse is consistently justified in simple terms: security. The Munich Security Conference in February 2011 provided Prime Minister David Cameron with a platform for addressing some of the issues that had been simmering continually and erupting sporadically since 2001, noting the, quote, segregated communities behaving in ways that run counter to our values, and proposing that, quote, frankly, we need a lot less of the passive tolerance of recent years and much more active muscular liberalism. This is arguably a significant moment in which muscular liberalism takes shape, bringing to the fore a discourse of Britishness, religion, the secular state, cultural values and social mores. And of course, the teacher standards play into this new muscular liberalism by requiring teachers to promote fundamental British values within and outside of school. So too does the prevent duty, which builds on the notion of muscular liberalism to place a statutory duty upon education professionals to act as key agents in countering radicalisation, such that teachers become both policy subjects and policy actors in schools. One consequence of the prevent duty is a proliferation of support materials in schools. Subject associations, unions, dioceses and publishing companies have produced myriad materials to aid teachers in countering radicalisation and extremism. Arguably, such resources are not simply neutral teaching aids for the classroom, they are, as David Lundy suggests, in and of themselves, securitised. And so a first recommendation from our research is the necessity to support teachers to read and engage with these materials critically. The securitised discourse also has the potential to influence the ways in which educators construct pupils, and Heath Kelly's concept of the pre-crime space is helpful here. Applied to education, this is the space in the classroom where teachers might, post 9/11, view pupils as having more or less propensity for radicalisation, as more or less inhabiting a pre-crime space. And this, of course, has the potential to have a significant effect on the psychological contract between the teacher and the learner, which is trust, and that is the cornerstone of such relationships. And so the second recommendation from our research is the need to support teachers even further to become experts in maintaining trusting relationships while engaging in complex discussions of radicalisation and extremism. After all, as Ramsey notes, the concept of a safe space can be difficult to achieve when teachers are required to report young people who express extremist views to Channel. The education system of any country is, of course, nested within a wider policy context, and in the UK, the securitised discourse was also evolving in relation to government attitudes towards immigration and constructs of citizenship. Theresa May had been Home Secretary for 2 years when, in 2012, she declared in an interview with The Telegraph that, quote, "The aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migration. What we don't want is a situation where people think that they can come here and overstay because they're able to access everything they need." The most apparent expression of the hostile environment was what has become known as the Windrush scandal, where members of the Windrush generation who arrived in the UK between 1948 and 1973 were treated as illegal immigrants. And some argue too that schools became embroiled in the technology of the hostile environment, where Education Regulations 2016 required schools to collect data on nationality, country of birth, and proficiency in speaking, reading and writing in English, although this ceased in 2018. By 2017, you will know that the Home Secretary at the time, Sajid Javid, disowned the term hostile environment in favour of compliant environment. So let's take stock. The last decade in the UK has seen the intensification of deportation and a rising insecurity in relation to immigrant status. 2012 saw the terminology and technology of the hostile environment launched on the British public, with the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 16 introducing new forms of border enforcement. This was the context in which Prime Minister Cameron called for a new muscular liberalism to address the failures of multiculturalism, and where, in a time of resurgent nationalism, the UK voted to withdraw from the European Union. This then was also the context within which the teacher standards were implemented, where the discourse of fundamental British values was introduced in curricula across the UK, and where the prevent duty, with its requirement to prevent pupils from becoming radicalised or taking part in terrorist activities, became part of the professional role of the teacher. Part 2. In this part of the presentation, I shall consider the rise of nationalism, and secular nationalism in particular, as a lens through which we can contextualise fundamental British values in the classroom. Paradigmatically, nationalism can be read through the lens of classical modernism, underpinned by the notion that nations are the cornerstone of the modern world. A relatively modern phenomena, nationalism offers a technical approach to the concept of the nation. That is, nations can be replicated by organising communication systems, urbanisation, mass education and political participation. Well, there's not time this afternoon to immerse ourselves in theories of nationalism, but suffice it to say that the modernist view promotes the notion of the active citizen in the construction of the nation. The modernist paradigm of nations foregrounds political communities, emphasises rationality, civic duty, and invests in civic infrastructure such as transport, media, education, and political parties. Of course, in such a nation state, religion, notions of the family and gender are subordinate to one's identity as citizen. The modernisation thesis was arguably affected by the processes of industrialisation, urbanisation and secularisation, which was expressed in the separation of the church from the state in the medieval period. And Hegel suggests that the inexorable decline of religion is part of the process of progress, a loss of social significance and an expectation that religion will become privatised. The individual is free to explore her own spirituality, no longer locked into religion as cultural inheritance. And yet, there is a contradiction between the way the process of modernity has advanced secularism through decoupling the church from the state, while simultaneously constructing a British historical identity. The place of the secular norm, religion and British values have come to the fore in recent times from both government and the Church of England. And here I offer two examples. First, Baroness Farcy, Britain's first female cabinet minister and chair of the Conservative Party, made a stand in 2012 against militant secularisation, following a decision that local councils could not hold meetings where prayers were said. Second, Lord Carey, former Archbishop of Canterbury, has questioned secular dominance in British society. In 2012, he took a case to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that Christians are vilified by the state, that the outward expression of traditional conservative Christian values has been banned under a new secular conformity of belief and conduct. You may recall that the case was in relation to the wearing of a crucifix in the workplace. It's against this backdrop of debate about the place of religion, of militant secularism and rising nationalism that fundamental British values, or British values, have been introduced into the curriculum. The requirement to promote once fundamental, now British values sits at a nexus of issues: policy, pedagogy, curriculum, social justice, securitisation, national identity and values education. Some suggest that the execution of fundamental British values is having a detrimental impact on minority groups. Some groups feel more alienated, more isolated, more segregated within society because of the promotion of fundamental British values. And so a third recommendation from our research is to support teachers to further counter this potential detrimental impact on minority groups. A phenomena of the promotion of fundamental British values in education is that through their othering, pupils remain silent rather than speak out. And as you would expect, therefore, developing pupil voice in relation to British values, radicalisation and extremism is a further recommendation. In the classroom context, there are likely to be pupils from differing religious and cultural backgrounds. And in such a diverse context, teachers must find ways of opening up discussions that give voice to differing cultural communities in order to facilitate the development of the young citizen in a context of rising migration, issues around the construct of the vulnerable, around the pre-crime space, and assimilationist assumptions in policy enactment. The promotion of monocultural values sits uncomfortably and inadequately within the context of globalisation and the cultural richness in British schools. Our research points to the need for teachers to have opportunities to engage authentically with pupils and their communities in exploring issues, including those of faith, and community engagement is essential here. Our research also points to the need for creative, safe spaces for for student teachers and experienced teachers to have opportunity to model such discussions, to learn how to navigate these issues with skill. The introduction of fundamental British values will have been a lost opportunity if it is only interpreted through a nationalist, technical and rational lens. If we can focus on values, bring values education to the fore, we have the opportunity to counter the narratives of Britain, and here I reference Homi Bhabha, in terms of the wars we fought and the flags we flew, and instead create a richer narrative of diversity, cultural wealth and inclusion in contemporary Britain. Thank you. So, colleagues, I think now we're handing over to Catherine Jensen, our colleague Catherine, who's going to navigate her way through questions, and Paul and I will attempt to give some answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Hazel. Yes, there's been lots of interesting questions, so I think we'll just dive straight in. The first question is for Paul, and it's from Richard Race from Roehampton University, asking how many people in your research and experience are actually teaching Prevent and Channel in schools, colleges and universities? Are colleagues getting the diversity and awareness training through CPD to actually do this?
Firstly, hello Richard, good to have you with us. So just to emphasise, the research I reported on there was in the first 18 months. And what that highlighted was quite substantial initial training, whole school, whole staff training. But this issue of continuing sort of CPD is one that needs further investigation, I think, absolutely. I think people certainly reported varied sort of quality of input on training, but the schools and colleges that had input from their local Prevent coordinators and Prevent education officers felt really well supported. A broader issue is around the pedagogical issue, and obviously this relates to Hazel's input about British values, that there was much more mixed views around the original version of the Educate Against Hate website. And all of us from educational backgrounds know how much help and support there needs to be in adaptation, there needs to be in any sort of pedagogical curriculum materials. So I think we do need more research around that, and we need more engagement with practitioners about how well supported they feel, particularly around that thing that Hazel alluded to about having difficult conversations and engaging in debates around extremism, around identity, around and the nature of inequality.
Thanks. And then I think there is a sort of follow-up question from Alistair Sample, again for Paul. How aware are the students themselves of the Prevent responsibilities, and do educators make this duty explicit? Although I suppose Hazel might also have some thoughts, so could maybe join in after Paul.
I think that's very hard to say for two reasons. One is that the curricular input, including around British values, is not necessarily a new thing and not clearly linked back to Prevent, partly because of the continuity identified, but also we found in our research, for instance, that schools were doing lots of things to try and make sure that there weren't negative impacts from or there wasn't a sense of bias in that input. So we found a number of schools, for instance, were doing more input around racism and around tackling racism to balance any concern, the sort of concerns that Hazel identified. We found some schools that actually introduced debating societies. So there'd been a counterintuitive effect of more openness and more political education or citizenship debate, if you want. But I guess in the other sort of part of that, Alistair, is if students are referred to Channel or if there's a concern that might be leading towards a Prevent referral. Now, what there should be is student awareness of that, because family and students should be aware, should be involved in discussions even before there is a formal Prevent referral. But again, I think we need more research around what the actual experience has been. Are students being referred towards Prevent without knowing about it? That's one of the allegations, but we need more evidence of that.
thanks. And then I think there's a question for Hazel. It's short, but it's certainly not easy. Is multiculturalism dead?
I think this is a really complex question. I think, you know, there are arguments on both sides. I mean, I know that Paul and Shamim and Pete have done some research recently to show that no, they were finding, you know, areas of social cohesion and multiculturalism in, you know, in different areas. But I don't think it is, I have to say. But I wonder if I might, Catherine, just very briefly loop back to the previous question, because just to pick up Alistair's question there in terms of what's going on in schools, what our research showed was that it's a mixed bag in terms of what's going on. And so in some schools, and these were rare, but in some schools there was a top-down approach taken, which was rather transactional, where you know, a leadership team would be informing pupils, perhaps in an assembly, for example, you know, about prevent, about fundamental British values, about radicalisation and so on. Whereas in other schools, and it really largely depended on the approach that the leadership team took, and also absolutely crucially the skill of the individual teacher. That might be an RE teacher, might be a citizenship teacher, or somebody else, but it was really around their skill and the confidence they had to navigate those issues. So our research demonstrated that that was very much a mixed bag, and it's part of the recommendation from this latest research.
Can I just add to that, Catherine? Certainly at least one of the schools we researched in, teachers had actually worked with some Muslim sixth form pupils to actually review materials and get them involved in the types of curriculum materials that have been done in support prevent in schools. It's at least some institutions, pupils were being actively involved.
Great, thanks. Another question for Hazel. What are your thoughts around the recent instruction that schools should not use resources of any organisations that take extreme political stances in matters?
Well, that's understandable from a policy perspective, and you know, and part of the role of the school is to protect young people. It's part of the prevent duty. The question is, what is an extreme view? Nigel Genders, Chief Education Officer from the Church of England, gave a presentation at the University of Gloucestershire 3 years ago to say that he could be regarded as an extremist for his views because he does hold extreme Church of England views. So the question is, how do we understand extremism? And I think this is rather a grey area here. I mean, it's clear what we understand, you know, the most extremist views to be, but I think research needs to be done on this further as well. You know, where do we stand, for example, on the Church of England, on views within the Church of England, or the Catholic Church, just to pick two out of the book. So I think it's a complex question.
Yes, thanks. Again, Hazel, there's more questions around unpacking the detrimental effect of othering as a result of the fundamental British values as it applies to practitioners and teachers working in early childhood education or primary education. And Jenny Robson is saying that this effect of othering was a finding in her research and the implementation of the fundamental British values.
Mm-hmm. I think, Jenny, that you're absolutely right, and this points to the need for certainly for further research, but probably substantial professional learning and development, and a real focus on how we open up these issues, even with very youngest of children. And we know how to research with the very youngest of children. We have sophisticated methodological tools at our fingertips to begin to open up conversations with the very youngest people and begin to give them agency and understanding. And so I think we should bring these things to the fore and begin to use some of that methodological expertise that we have to explore these issues with young children. But I believe that we can do this. The question is the degree to which we do it and how we phrase it, the language that we use, but I think it's perfectly possible. But I want to go back to one of my final findings, which is that we have to include the community, the family and the community within these discussions. It's not something I think that we should do. It's not as rich as it could possibly do if we only do this within the confines of the school.
We had a very interesting sort of finding building on that, which was that we identified that educationists were fairly content about how they were implementing Prevent, but they also then said they did have a concern that nationally the Prevent duty might lead to further stigmatisation of Muslim students. So to us that showed a great social awareness amongst educators, but they were adamant that in their own institution they were doing things to avoid that, whether it's the range of types of extremism they were focusing on, the way they were approaching. So some educators said it was making them realise they'd not done enough in recent times around equality and anti-racism. But obviously that's not, you know, we can't claim that's a representative set of schools, and the sort of the concerns that Jenny's reported in her research, you know, I'd echo Hazel's comments.
And I guess in this same area, there's a comment from Natalie James from the University of Leeds also talking about, is there a need to move away from, in terms of the fundamental British values agenda, away from the language of Britishness? I don't know whether you, Hazel, you want to comment?
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't think I'd want to move away from the language of Britishness. I want to embrace it further and represent contemporary Britain in all its wealth and richness. I think we should be brave enough to embrace it. It is, after all, Britain. The question is, how do we understand it? Homi Bhabha's work is really helpful here. Do we understand it simply as something that's in our DNA? And as I said earlier, you know, is it to do with British history, kings and queens and all the rest of it? Or has that narrative been interrupted? And can we bring in a new narrative, post-Windrush, if you like, but a new narrative? It's not actually a new narrative, it's an authentic narrative around Britain today. And my point around you know, post-secularism and secular nationalism is really important here, because it is to do with people and their lives and families, and that's to do with how the pupils with whom we interact in schools live in families and the values of those families. And so I would want to embrace it and take it further forward.
And I think Hazel mentioned the sort of 2001 riots, and one of the things that came out of that was David Blunkett, then Education Secretary, really foregrounded citizenship education, building on the work of Bernard Crick and the Crick Commission. And that was one of the real drivers of Gordon Brown's discussion of Britishness. So the conception then was very much, as Hazel suggested, an inclusive British identity that has to be built and celebrated, not the more nationalistic sort of conceptions that some have argued for.
Thanks, and perhaps just following on from this focus on nations, Gary John Barnes has a question for Paul about what approaches are being taken in other nations' schools in response to acts of terrorism. Do they foreground values education? Because obviously the UK approach is unique in that there is a legal duty.
Hi, Gary. I think there's a couple of things. I think although there isn't a legal duty in any other country, the role of educators, both in schools but also informal educators, in terms of referring young people to multi-agency sort of processes, is established. You know, in countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, they've got long established processes around other forms of social harm that are being used. So although we've got a legal duty, there is that other countries do something similar. And in fact, our research suggested that whether the legal duty was there or not, British educators were now accepting that radicalisation was one of the legitimate social harms that they should be concerned about. But in terms of pedagogy, a lot of other countries do a lot more about civics education or citizenship education. And most, you know, writers like Lynn Davis, who's written an excellent book, Educating Against Extremism, highlights that it's more politics in school, more in a way, more extreme ideas need to be there in school and discussed openly in a framework of citizenship education to help students understand complexity and debate complexity of ideas, but also complexity of identities. And other countries do have a stronger role for that within their curricula, a stronger place within what schools and colleges do. And it's one of the missing pieces of the jigsaw as the prevent duties come in. The focus on citizenship teaching and the specialist role of citizenship teaching in British education has gone backwards.
Thanks. And I think there's another question for Paul, and it's around 5 o'clock, so we might wind up with this the last question, if that's okay. Let me know if you want to carry on slightly longer, but this is about implementing Prevent, and Jessie Blackburn from the Durham Law School is asking, how did teachers understand the terms of extremism and radicalisation, given that they are rather nebulous terms, and in relation to radicalisation, the government's Prevent duty doesn't have a single definition. So
hi Jessie. No, and it's a very good point. I think what we reported was that teachers were confident that radicalisation or vulnerability to it was a legitimate part of safeguarding, but there they felt like they're focusing much more on vulnerability. They understood the nature and the processes of youth vulnerability towards social harms. They knew there was something, there was a real reality of terrorist involvement, but as soon as we get to defining it in a more detailed way, it is problematic. And I guess some of the critics have said, the so-called ERG22 of indicators of moves towards radicalisation that other academic colleagues have critiqued, were they being used directly in the training of educators? And we found that they were only partly showing up, and it was much more a core gut professional instinct about the nature of vulnerability, rather than a very clearly defined nature of what radicalisation is. I think internationally it's accepted that any list of indicators of what a move towards radicalisation is or how it shows is hugely problematic. There's no one clear pathway, and any indicator can describe all sorts of people who will never move towards radicalisation. We didn't feel that educators were actually using such a to B sort of understanding. It was something, in a way, it was more nebulous, but maybe a lot of professional practice around safeguarding young people is exactly that sort of nebulousness. I think, just briefly on extremism, I think it's accepted that in recent years attempts to define extremism legally have been hugely problematic, and that's why there's been no progress on it. And in many ways, it muddies the water. And the Commission for Counter and Extremism, the government body, which declare an interest among the academic advisory group of that, they talk about hateful extremism as something much more specific and tangible about promoting hate towards others. That extremism is. I have an extreme love of Leeds United, so extremism is a hugely problematic term, and we didn't find that educators were focusing on it.
Thanks, Paul. I don't know whether you have any comments on that, Hazel. Otherwise, I think there's thanks in the chats, and there's a few more thoughts around British values, but we might be wrapping up the chat here unless Hazel and Paul want to pick up on any specific points.
I'd just add to what Paul said, and not anything further about extremism, but in terms of radicalisation, yeah, of course these things are so difficult to get hold of. There are, N theories about radicalisation. This has been theorised for many years, and so it's not surprising that it's very difficult to get a handle on these things, which is why we need to ensure that we have substantial professional learning and development opportunities for teachers to be able to talk about these things, to make sense of them.
I was just reflecting on Francis's comment about how it's burdening teachers, and hello Francis, by the way, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and what we found in our research, I know Hazel's comment, is that educators were doing all sorts of things to mitigate the impacts on the students and the communities, and to make it fit with their practice. And I guess that's why we've drawn the work of Ball and Maguire and Annette Braun around policy enactment, that this was another example of how they enact yet another measure alongside. And arguably what you're identifying, Francis, is a generic reality of modern education, about the volume of government strictures, requirements, that essentially we look for schools and colleges to almost do everything in modern society in terms of welfare as well as education and crime prevention. And there is a huge overburden generically that Prevent is just part of, is my perspective.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'd like to say thanks to Paul Thomas and Hazel Bryan, and thanks to everyone who's attended. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks for all the questions. See you at the next HUTCRIS seminar, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining in.
Bye now.